My mom once told me a story from when she was a kid during the Great Depression, a really tough time from 1929 to 1939 when lots of people lost their jobs and homes, and there wasn't enough food to go around. She always remembered this scary thing that happened like it was yesterday. Back then, she lived with my great-grandma and the rest of her family in a small town with lots of farms and a railroad running through it. One day, one of her aunt's boyfriends, who sold used cars, made a bunch of money, and feeling happy and a bit drunk, gave my great-grandma a 20 bill. He told her to treat herself to whatever she wanted. So, my great-grandma, all excited, decided to walk to the grocery store a mile away to buy some goodies for everyone. At that time, $20 was a lot of money, kind of like having $200 today. So, she and my mom headed out to the store together. When they got there, they saw two sketchy-looking guys hanging around outside, but they didn't really bother them. They shopped, and as my great-grandma was paying, those guys started paying attention, especially when they saw the change she got back. Leaving the store, my mom and great-grandma started walking home through the fields. It was getting dark, and soon my great-grandma got really scared because she saw this old beat-up pickup truck with no lights on creeping up behind them. She grabbed my mom's hand, and they both ran into a cornfield. My great-grandma told my mom to duck down as low as she could and to be as quiet as possible. They hid deep in the cornfield, and at one point, my great-grandma told my mom to lie flat on the ground and not make a sound. My mom could see the light from a flashlight moving all over the place and could hear the corn stalks moving as the guys in the pickup, who had been outside the store, searched for them. It felt like forever to my mom, but eventually, my great-grandma said it was okay to get up, and they made it home safely. Back in those days, you'd often hear about people getting hurt or even killed over a little bit of money. For years, every time my mom talked about that night, she'd get really upset, thinking about what could have happened to her and my great-grandma if those guys had found them in the cornfield. Back in 1929, during the Great Depression, things were rough for everyone in our small farming town. My name's Joe, and I was just a kid back then, but I remember it like it was yesterday. Food was scarce, jobs were scarcer, and hope was just a word that seemed to have lost its meaning to most folks. But the hardest part wasn't the hunger or the poverty. It was something that happened one night, something that's haunted me ever since. My family had a small piece of land that we farmed, and my folks did whatever they could to make ends meet. One evening, after a long day of trying to coax a few more vegetables out of the parched soil, my dad announced that he needed to go into town to pick up some supplies. He promised to be back before dark. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, he hadn't returned. My mom tried to hide her worry, but I could see it in her eyes. Night in the countryside was a different kind of dark, the kind that felt like it could swallow you whole. With my dad not back, and my mom growing more anxious by the minute, I decided to go look for him. She begged me not to, told me it was too dangerous to wander out at night, especially now. There had been talk in town of strange sightings, shadows moving in the night, and folks disappearing without a trace. I didn't believe in ghost stories, though, and insisted I'd be fine. I grabbed an old lantern and headed out, the light barely making a dent in the darkness. The path to town was a familiar one, but that night, it seemed alien, twisted, and longer than I remembered. Every rustle in the bushes, every snap of a twig underfoot made my heart race. I told myself it was just the wind, just a rabbit or a deer moving through the brush. But part of me didn't believe it. Halfway to town, I found my dad's truck abandoned on the side of the road, one tire flat. There was no sign of him. My worry turned to fear as I called out for him, my voice disappearing into the night. That's when I saw it. A light, or rather, several lights, flickering in the distance, off the path that led to Miller's old farm. Everyone knew to avoid the Miller place. After the bank took their land, something had happened to old man Miller. He'd changed, turned mean, and folks said worse. The place was supposed to be empty, but those lights suggested otherwise. I knew I should have turned back. But I thought maybe, just maybe, Dad went there seeking help for the flat. So, I followed the lights through the fields, the Miller farm growing larger and more ominous with every step. The lights led to the barn, its doors hanging off their hinges, the sound of whispers spilling out into the night. "Hello," I called out, stepping inside, the lantern shaking in my hand. The whispers stopped. Silence fell, heavy and suffocating. Then, out of the darkness, a figure emerged. It was Old Man Miller, or at least, what was left of him. His eyes were hollow, his skin stretched tight over his bones. He didn't speak, just pointed towards the back of the barn. I wanted to run, but my feet moved on their own, leading me to a corner covered in shadows. As my lantern's light pierced the darkness, I saw my dad, beat up, but alive. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. What did they do to my dad? I don't remember how I got my dad out of there, but I remember running, the sound of our pursuers close behind. And then somehow, we were back on the road, the first light of dawn creeping over the horizon. We didn't stop running until we reached our home, collapsing at the doorstep. My dad never talked about what happened that night, and I never went near the Miller farm again. During those times, people were desperate, and I suspect they were trying to rob my dad of what little money he had. I'm glad they let us go, and I always wondered what would have happened if I never went looking for my dad that night. Back in the day, during the depths of the Great Depression, life was hard. My family, like most around, was hanging by a thread, surviving on what little we could scrounge up. We lived in a small, run-down farmhouse, surrounded by miles of farmland that had seen better days. Our town was a speck on the map, barely making do with the few resources we had. My father had left in search of work, leaving my mother, my younger sister Ellie, and me to fend for ourselves. One chilly evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, my sister Ellie claimed she'd seen shadows moving in the cornfields. I doubted her, thinking she was just trying to mess with me. That night, after a meager dinner of watery soup, I lay awake thinking. My thoughts were interrupted by a soft, whimpering sound coming from Ellie's bed. I whispered, trying to comfort her, but she was inconsolable, mumbling about the shadows. Unable to sleep, I decided to prove to Ellie that there was nothing out there. I crept out of bed, grabbed a lantern, and made my way to the back door. The cool night air hit me like a slap in the face as I stepped outside, the lantern casting long, ominous shadows ahead of me. As I approached the cornfield, a sudden chill ran down my spine. The cornstalks rustled softly in the breeze, a sound that under different circumstances might have been comforting. But tonight, it sounded like whispers. I thought I could hear footsteps. I pushed forward, determined to shake the fear creeping up on me. That's when I saw it, a shadow darting between the rows of corn, too large and too fast to be any animal I knew. My heart raced as I stood frozen, the lantern trembling in my hand. The rustling grew louder, closer, as if the cornfield itself was alive and moving towards me. Panic set in, and I turned to run back to the house, but I stumbled, the lantern flying from my grasp and extinguishing upon hitting the ground. In the darkness, I could hear them, footsteps, soft but clear. I scrambled to my feet, my breaths coming in short, sharp gasps as I sprinted back to the safety of our home. Bursting through the door, I locked it behind me, my whole body shaking. Ellie was sitting up in bed, eyes wide with fear. I tried to speak, to tell her it was nothing, but the words wouldn't come. We huddled together in bed until the first light of dawn crept through the windows, the night's terrors slowly fading as the sun rose. But the horror wasn't over. The next day, we heard whispers among the townsfolk of a family not far from us who'd disappeared in the night. Their home was left untouched, meals still on the table, beds unmade, as if they'd been plucked right out of existence. The story spread like wildfire, theories abounding about what had happened. Some said it was the work of drifters, desperate and dangerous. Life went on, as it always does. But Ellie and I never forgot that night. We never ventured near the cornfields at night again, and before bed we'd listen for the noises, praying they wouldn't come for us. Years later, long after the depression had ended, and we'd moved away from that place, I still wonder what, or who, it could have been.